I'm going to try to talk about a couple different things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the federal government in promoting sustainable development, and specifically about what my office does at EPA. I'm going to talk about a partnership my office formed, or my agency formed, EPA formed, with HUD and DOT, called the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we've done in Louisiana, and end with sort of our current situation, which I'm sorry to say is a bit uncertain these days, as you may have read in the newspaper. I start by thanking Rob for inviting me back to New Orleans. I always love coming here. It's a great city, and I never am here long enough. We need to love our cities, especially our old cities that have history and architecture and character and a sense of place that's really distinctive, and of course New Orleans has all of that. When Rob was at EPA, he was the Deputy Associate Administrator for EPA's Office of Policy, and in that capacity he was actually my boss, or one of my bosses. We arrived there about the same time in 2009, about 2 months after President Obama had been inaugurated. As Rob said, I spent first half of my career as a newspaper reporter, and I actually fell into the smart growth world when I worked for Governor Glendenning. I hadn't planned on that as a career change, but this is what I ended up doing. We passed a smart growth initiative in Maryland in 1997, and we immediately were just inundated with requests from around the country about what we were doing and how we did it and why we did it and how we got it through the legislature. And the governor wanted someone to be a point person for answering those questions and everything, and asked me to do it. And I was at the time running his press office, which has to be the worst job of my life. It's slightly better than picking tomatoes in high school, but not much. So I was glad to do this, and I really fell into a second career. I am not trained in this field. What I know about smart growth, I've learned from doing over the last 15, 16 years, I guess. And the kind things that Rob said about my staff is absolutely true, but they were that way before I even arrived, and I'm just trying to keep them from failing. They're doing a great job. One of the things I would say is that in the era that Rob and I worked together, he never worked with him like a boss. It was more like a colleague who shared the same interest in improving community life in America as the people in my office. And I don't know whether he realizes this or not, but he was actually in Washington in a very happy era. I actually think back on those years now sort of nostalgically, and it's only 3 years ago. President Obama had just been reelected, or just been elected the first time. There was really widespread optimism that the country had somehow turned a corner and that good things were right ahead of us. Naively, I think many of us thought we were entering an era of cooperation for the good of the country. Naively, we thought it was finally time to tackle together some of the nation's big and most intransigent problems. At EPA, I think the Bush years had taken a toll on some of the folks who had worked there for years, many of whom felt the agency had too often ignored some of the realities of sound science. And of course, nowhere was this more evident than on the issue of global warming and climate change, issues that both Rob and his friend and immediate boss, Lisa Heinzling, came to the agency to address. That more wasn't done on this issue during President Obama's first term is not due to lack of effort, nor is it a reflection on the work that Rob and Lisa did. Who knew that the pendulum would swing again so quickly after the 2008 election, that it would swing so decisively, so wildly, and so apart from the hopes and aspirations of this new administration. In the brief time that Rob and Lisa and I worked together, many things seemed possible. Our budgets were sound, and in some instances, they were actually growing. The work of my smart growth office, it was about 16 people when I arrived in 2009. And think of that in terms of the entire federal government. That's a small little group. It was long a quiet little secret within EPA but it was suddenly in 2009 in vogue. When my office when the Smart Growth Program within EPA started, it was in 1996, same year that when I worked with Governor Glendening, he was putting his Smart Growth Initiative together. But in those days, smart growth was really a peripheral issue in DC, in Maryland, in most of the country. But by 2009, I think it had really become a mainstream issue, and by 2013, I can tell you I believe it is a mainstream issue now. I hear big city Democratic mayors, I hear small town Republican mayors, I hear transportation commissioners in rural states talking about that they have no choice now but to do smart growth. Things have really changed in this regard. I was also lucky at EPA that we had an administrator at the time, Lisa Jackson, who has just left office, and she understood what smart growth was about, and she promised to give support to my office and to increase my resources, and she was good to her word. So EPA's mission is to protect the environment and public health. And the way the Smart Growth Office supports this mission is by looking at the ways the built environment affects the natural environment. How and especially where we build affects, where we build our cities, our towns, our rural villages, how that affects the natural environment. But to do that work, you have to delve into the always contentious issue of local land use. I used to say that the good news in America is that land use authority is primarily vested at the local level. But the bad news in America is that land use is vested at the local level. And it really cuts both ways. And I think part of the challenge in smart growth is trying to figure out when's the most appropriate time to have that local look at it, and when there is a more regional or statewide or even a national issue that needs to be addressed. It's not that it's one versus the other, it's some combination of all of those. But because of the sensitivity about local authority over land use, there's always been a degree of nervousness in my office and at federal agencies in general about delving into land use issues. My office has learned the hard way before I ever got there and has been particularly careful to try not to overstep our authority and to be equally careful about how we publicly talk about what we do. For example, we offer ideas, options, guidance, but we don't offer direction or dictates. We don't want locals to think the federal government is telling them what to do in terms of local land use. Yet the interesting thing to me is it's not as if the federal government hasn't always had a big role in how growth and development plays out on the ground at the local level. Let me just mention a few of the ways. How about the construction of the interstate highway system? Or generally the funding of highways, transit, airports, ports? How about veterans benefits bestowed on returning soldiers after World War II that, among other things, underwrote mortgages and enabled many to move out of the city and into newly connected suburbs? How about official redlining by federal housing agencies that kept blacks and whites in separate but surely not equal neighborhoods? How about federal housing programs that built, to our later regret, high-rise, low-income housing that had the effect of concentrating poverty, creating ideal conditions for crime, and decimating older cities and their public schools at the same time? Or how about just the 1970s phenomenon of urban renewal, which was mostly a bulldozer? How about a system of tax incentives that lured downtown businesses to the suburbs and then just as often lured suburban businesses to exurban farm fields? I could go on, but the point is that the federal government has always been a big player in how our cities and towns and villages are developed. Just think back to the construction of the C&O Canal or the transatlantic or transcontinental railroad. We have at the federal level an effect on local land use. What my office has tried to do over its existence is say we could be smarter about how we do this. So EPA, as I'm sure you all know, is a big regulatory agency. That's its primary reason for being. You have the Clean Air Act, and so we regulate or try to regulate air pollution. issues. And we have the Clean Water Act, and we regulate water pollution. We try to clean up brownfields and superfunds and other contaminated lands. The little part of EPA that I'm in is a non-regulatory part of the agency. And the theory behind having my office, and I think this would be true locally too, is that EPA can't get to its goals through regulation alone. If we don't deal with growth patterns, the resulting environmental impacts, frankly, will eat our lunch, and we just won't be able to do it. Our work is largely about location, about where things are built, not where things are built. And I think we've reached a tipping point where now there is ever-increasing demand for help with this work from all cities of all sizes. I think the reason we've hit this tipping point, I think largely, lately, is because of money. You know, we're out of money, so we have to start thinking. And when we start thinking, we realize we can't afford to build the way we have over the last 50 or 75 years. It's unsustainable socially, economically, environmentally. At the end of the day, when you look at the different effects of a smart growth development pattern, it can help you in multiple ways. It can help you clean the air. It can help you clean the water. It can help you clean up contaminated lands. And the added plus is that it makes communities more economically attractive places to be. Ever since the recession hit a few years ago, there has been increased emphasis in my office and in most federal agencies to demonstrate that the work that we're doing actually has a positive effect on the economy. I sometimes recall the New Yorker cartoon where the guy says, in this economy, you have to start every sentence with, in this economy. And that's sort of the way a lot of the federal programs are right now. But I think there's a fair amount of evidence that shows that a smart growth, sustainable development plan is actually good economically. It saves money through lower transportation and infrastructure costs. It creates jobs in construction, maintenance, rehabilitation of older buildings, cleanup and redevelopment of brownfields. It increases private investments by providing amenities like public transportation that tend to attract other investment. It makes money through higher property values from redeveloped shopping centers, reclaimed buildings or lots, or by providing places with more transportation and housing options. And the interesting thing is it meets our current market demand rather than building for the Wally and June Cleaver era of the 50s or 60s. It meets a demand from aging baby boomers, some of whom are in this very room, and who are going to want a different lifestyle than a big suburban lot. And it meets the needs and desires of the Gen X and Gen Y generations who don't want to live in the suburbs either. They want more active, I mean, I'm generalizing here, but more active 24/7 communities. So my office was set up in 1996. I don't think it has ever officially been called the Smart Growth Program. It's had a variety of different names. As Rob said, it's now the Office of Sustainable Communities. We were reorganized in 2010 when Rob was there, and as part of that reorganization, we were doubled in size and budget, but we are still very small. We have about 30 on my staff now, but if you took all of my budget and gave it to the Federal Highway Administration, you'd probably have enough money to build about 4 lane miles of highway. It's relatively small, but I would say this office has had an outsized impact on changing the conversation about these issues and in leveraging others who have much bigger dollars to do this kind of work. When I inherited a staff that was entrepreneurial, self-selected. They wanted to come to the EPA Smart Growth Program. They have a certain level of competitiveness among themselves to come up with new and different ideas. There's a freedom in my office to let staff pick up on an idea that they really want to pursue, within the boundaries of smart growth, and try to find a new way of doing things. And we have a lot of success that way. We talk about our elevator speech. We talk about our work in doing 3 different things. We try to change the conversation. We try to change the rules, and we try to help the willing. When I say change the conversation, I'm talking about having an annual National Smart Growth Conference. We were just in Kansas City in February, and we'll have another one next February somewhere else. We have an annual Smart Growth Awards program where we highlight the best projects that we can find around the country. We have a long list of publications that we talks about every different element of how you do smart growth. On changing the rules, we work with local governments that want to change their own codes, whether it's building codes, zoning codes, street designs. We work with state agencies, state governments, governors, and other federal agencies on the criteria they use for distributing formula money. We sometimes work with non-governmental standard-setting organizations because the standards they set are often then later adopted by local or state governments, and if they adopt the wrong standard, you can end up with a bad outcome. I think that one of the one bit of genius in my office, and again, this isn't anything I did, this is something I inherited, is that my office has always looked at the root cause, the root rule that gives you an outcome that you may not like, and gone back to the base and said, if I change that rule, maybe I'll get a better outcome or a different outcome. And a lot of our work is in that way. In terms of working with the willing, this is the biggest change in our office. When I came there 4 years ago, I would say we probably, I don't know what the number is, but I would say we probably worked in 20 or 25 communities a year. Now we're working in 150 to 200 communities a year. Now about 60% of my budget, my small budget nonetheless, but about 60% of my budget is now direct technical assistance to communities. And the reason we did this is we had more demand than we could possibly meet. We still have more demand than we could possibly meet. My office has 4 different kinds of technical assistance. I'll go through them really quickly, and I can answer questions about them if you want to know more. One is called the Governor's Institute on Community Design, where we go in and work with individual governors who invite us in and have a growth and development issue, and we bring national experts to them to help them figure out their problem. I think of it as bringing knowledge to power. And the worst thing that can happen to the governor is he wastes a day. The best thing is he gets an idea and a shortcut on how to fix something. We have one we call Smart Growth Implementation Assistance, SGIA. This program is really the basis for a lot of our later publications. We look for cutting-edge issues that we do not know the answer to, and we go to a community and help the community with that issue, but that isn't really our point. We want to help the community, but what we're really trying to do is learn something about that issue that then can be replicable to other communities around the country facing similar issues. We do about 4 of those a year, 3 or 4. They take a year or they take 18 months to go from beginning to end. We have a popular little program called Greening America's Capitals. We're working, one of them is in Baton Rouge right now. It is aimed at capital cities. It is a demonstration program. We spend about $80,000 a pop for each city we go to. We do about 5 state capitals a year. The idea is to help with a downtown neighborhood near the state capitol, put in green infrastructure, redesign their street, do other things that will bring what's usually a dead community area or dead neighborhood back to life again. Why we do it is we think that it's under the watchful eye of a governor, a general assembly, cabinet secretaries, and all of the people who come to a state capitol to visit. And that maybe they'll say, hey, I like what they did there, maybe I can do that in my community. The last time of technical assistance is called building blocks. How are we doing on time? We all right? Okay. Building blocks is our newest type of technical assistance. We realized we were not reaching as many communities as we had hoped to reach or being able to satisfy the demand. And a lot of the communities were asking for the same or similar kind of help. I need help with, I have a parking problem in my city. What do I do with parking? I hear about these complete streets or green streets. How do you design one of those? We'd like to have a bike share program in my office, or we would like to have a bike share in my office. Like to have a bike share in my community. How do you set one up? These types of things. And so we are developing about 14 or 15 different tools like that that can be delivered to multiple cities or towns or communities that are asking for that specific kind of help. So we can go in and tell a community in a day how to do a parking audit or how to design a complete street and that sort of work. We do this through contractors primarily, although our staff do go out. We usually have a preliminary call with the community. We go spend a day with them, like a charrette for the day about their issue and walk their community and help them with it. Go away and give them an implementation memo and move on to the next town. I think of this as sort of a starter drug for smart growth. It gets them hooked. And once they get going on this, then they think, well, that wasn't too painful. Maybe I can do a little bit more. Building blocks has turned into be a very popular part of our program. We do, my office does one other thing about building blocks before I leave it. Even with that, we weren't able to meet the demand. So we, in the last year and a half, I guess, or last year, we have given grants to non-government organizations such as Smart Growth America, Project for Public Places, Global Green, and Forterra to deliver building blocks, technical assistance to communities on our behalf, but in their own way. And so we are reaching more communities than we have the resources to reach ourselves. My office does a number of other things. I'm not going to talk about them now other than just to mention we do work on green building issues. We work with the Office of Water on green infrastructure issues, historic buildings, and how to tie together green building and historic building renovations, on school location issues, on health facilities location issues. We do some original research. We do a annual or biannual study on residential trends that looks at how much infill development is occurring or not occurring. We did a research project with a development firm called the Jonathan Rose Companies that looked at the amount of BTUs produced by houses, whether they are either green building houses or not green building houses, and then whether they are located far from the city center, close to the city center, or in the city center. And it really demonstrates the energy efficiency of both green building and smart growth approaches. And we continue to put out various kinds of publications. The most recent one is we put one out at our last conference in February that tries to bridge the gap between the environmental justice movement and the smart growth movement. As many of you probably know, there's been a fair amount of hostility from the environmental justice movement to the smart growth advocates because they often see it as gentrification and pushing displacement, pushing people out of their communities. And so what we try to do is come up with a publication that says to the environmental justice community, there really are some advantages to smart growth as long as you are at the table and can make sure that your issues are being heard. And to the smart growth side, we're saying you need to deal with the environmental justice communities or else your projects aren't going to be successful, and here are some approaches you can take. So one last thing about what's currently going on is you may have heard a lot lately, or at least in the last several months, about the issue of climate change again. I went back right after the president was reelected and looked at my climate change files and noticed that they had stopped suddenly in 2010. And it's because nothing happened after then. And this issue is really revived now, and what will happen over the next 3 or 4 years remains to be seen. But I think just as Katrina got everyone's attention, Superstorm Sandy up in the Northeast is the latest thing to really get people's attention. And as a result, there is a lot of work in a lot of federal agencies right now, including our own, my own, to try to figure ways to help communities adapt to this changing environment that we're in, and try to figure out how to rebuild, whether to rebuild, where to rebuild, and what to rebuild. My office has been working for about 3 or 4 years closely with FEMA. We have a MOA, with a memorandum of agreement with FEMA that essentially makes, when FEMA now goes into work as a result of their work with my office, and they are working in an area that has experienced a natural disaster, now as a result of this MOA, their default style of development that they recommend to communities rebuilding is a smart growth style of development. We are working with them in Joplin, Missouri after their tornado there. We're working up in Vermont after big floods there in the Mud River Valley, I think that's right. We're now working in New Jersey and New York with some of the Superstorm Sandy communities. And one thing my office is currently in the works of drafting, is some code advice to communities. I do want to, Rob's giving me the high sign, so let me just talk a little bit about 2 other things. Partnership. I'm sorry to interrupt. Is your mic on? Can you not hear me? No. I'm really sorry. I got it.
One's for the recording, one on its jack is for recording.
Is that any better? Is that any better? All right, I'm very sorry. I didn't know you couldn't hear me. I'll start over. Let me talk about 2 things. I want to talk about the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, and I want to talk about some of the work we've done in Louisiana and New Orleans. With regard to the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, one of the things that when I first came to EPA, I said naively to my staff that we should reach out to other federal agencies, not realizing that the common answer to that was either no answer from other federal agencies or a hostile answer, go away. And it became real clear real early in 2009 that things had changed in that regard. Our office was asked by HUD and DOT to review speeches that were written by Secretaries LaHood or written for Secretaries LaHood and Secretary Donovan at HUD and DOT. And what we discovered, to our amazement and happiness, was that they were really smart growth speeches. And we ended up being invited to a meeting in about May of 2009 by Senator Dodd's staff in the Senate Banking Committee to talk about what the 3 agencies might do together, and could we get the administrator of EPA and the 2 secretaries to come before the Banking Committee. And so we began to meet on a Wednesday afternoon, decided we would propose to our bosses that they do this joint presentation, first time it's ever been done before the Senate Banking Committee, and that they announced that they were going to form a partnership, and that this partnership was going to adopt the same set of principles, and all 3 agencies were going to work to the same goals. And so that's exactly what happened in June of 2009. They set up the Partnership for Sustainable Communities. The principles were more transportation choices, more equitable and affordable housing, increase economic competitiveness, support existing communities, leverage federal investments, and value communities and neighborhoods regardless of whether they are urban, suburban, or rural. Well, this partnership has been meeting every Wednesday afternoon for the last 4 years, and we continue to meet, and we believe we are beginning to change the way the federal government works in communities. HUD had millions of dollars that it was able to put out in regional planning grants around the country and some municipal planning grants. DOT had money that it used for Tiger multimodal transportation grants, and our office continues to do technical assistance. And together we had about 7,700 applications for assistance, wanting about $102 billion worth of assistance, and we were able to fund 744, about 10%, for about $3.5 billion. One of the things that we have done, though, recently is we have had the deputy secretaries and deputy administrator at our agencies put out memos that tries to get other parts of our agencies to adopt the same language in their RFPs, so that if the Office of Water or the Office of Air or some other part of EPA is putting out an RFP, it now incorporates, or we've asked them to incorporate requirements that people applying for their money show how this project would advance the livability principles, and to show how it is part of a local or regional integrated planning process, and to show how they are engaging community members in its implementation. And then if they get to a tiebreaker, we're asking them to say, did they already receive a grant from HUD, DOT, or EPA? And if they did, give them an extra point for that. Let me just jump to the end here and talk about some of the work we've done here. We've been in Louisiana and New Orleans off and on since 2001 at least. We've worked some up in Baton Rouge with the Center for Planning Excellence. In my University of Maryland days, I was down here lobbying on behalf of setting up a state-level Department of Planning, but I don't think it ever happened. I don't know whether anyone knows. I don't believe it ever happened. One thing that's going on now, and I asked Rob about this and he wasn't aware of it, is the Partnership for Sustainable Communities that I'm involved in is not the only intergovernmental initiative of this administration. There are several others, but one of them is called Strong Cities, Strong Communities. Has anybody in here heard of this? One, two, a few, okay. So this is an effort to identify cities that have been economically troubled for years, if not decades, and try a completely new approach to sort of break the cycle. And the approach is to take a large cross-departmental team and put them on the ground for up to 2 years, really embedded in City Hall in some cases, and see if they can serve as Sherpas to guide the cities through the federal government maze and help them get, or at least be aware of what resources there are to access, and to try to bring them some expertise and help. The cities that are involved in this right now in the first round are Fresno, California, Cleveland, Detroit, Memphis, Chester, Pennsylvania, and New Orleans. And it's called SC2, Strong Cities, Strong Communities. They are about to go out now for a second round. Last thing I'll say is Rob had asked me to mention something about the Claiborne Expressway. As some of you or all of you may know, there has been a study underway to decide what to do with whether to tear it down or not. And what I talked to my colleagues at Department of Transportation, what they said to tell you was it's not just studying a tear down, it is studying a partial tear down, it is studying alterations, it is studying leaving it alone, and it is studying whether there are better ways to use the area under the freeway, and that such as putting in a streetcar. So none of these have been decided yet. My colleague at DOT is a woman named Beth Osborne. She says there are strong forces on all sides, so folks need to think broader than everything or nothing. There's about almost $3 million in this study from a variety of sources. Public outreach was conducted in 2012 and will continue through the first half of 2013. And the study itself is going to be done in August of 2013. So the last thing I'll say is that where we are in Washington right now is really uncertain. You may have read there's a little budget problem in the Congress and with the president. Our budgets these days are getting cut pretty deeply. Staff, almost all staff are getting furloughed. It makes it difficult to continue some of the work we're doing when you no longer have either the money or the visibility of the money brings you. We think there are other things that we can continue to do in the absence of the money, but right now we're really at an uncertain time.